Straight up. Glory to God. Welcome back to your Way Happy Bible study. We are in the book of Acts. We are in chapter 26, verse 29. And Paul is talking to King Agrippa. He has been told that he will testify before governors and kings, and he sure is, isn't he? Festus is a governor, and King Agrippa is a king, obviously. And welcome, everybody. Hi, Shirley, Heath, Buffy, Lynn, all of you. God bless you. I'm so glad to see you. In verse 29 of Acts 26, and Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. The song that Troy was just playing, it says, your kindness, your goodness leads me to repentance. And that's what the word says. And that's what we've been discussing. Isn't that amazing? These things come together, because I'm sure Troy didn't know before that song, that was the words. I don't think he played it, that particular one, purposely. From what we were discussing, I think that everything is providence and God is in control. Glory to his name. Okay. In verse 29, Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. In verse 30, and when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice, and they that sat with them. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds. In verse 32, then said Agrippa unto Festus, this man might have been set at liberty, if he had not appealed unto Caesar. So it's the Lord is directing his steps. That's what the word says. A man deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. And that a righteous man's steps are ordained by the king. Glory to his name. Okay, let's go right into chapter 27. Hi, everybody in the chat room. I'm so glad you're here. Troy's in the chat room too. Okay. Glory to God. We love it when Troy comes. In verse 27, verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band. In verse 2. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. In verse How weird is it that I get a catch in my throat? Only when I do my show. Okay. In verse 3, and the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul, and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. So Paul is not a prisoner. He's not being treated as a prisoner. He's being treated as someone who is being given a ride to Rome. In verse 4, and when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. In verse 5, and when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. In verse 7, and when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmon. In verse 8, and hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. In verse 9, now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Not real surprising there, is that? In Acts 27, verse 12. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete. Now, you know where Crete is, don't you? It's an island south in the Mediterranean Sea, south of Italy, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. In verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. In verse 14, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind, called Euroclydon. Euroclydon. My bad. It's Euroclydon. In verse 15, and when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. In verse 16, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. In verse 17, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and, fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. Now, what Paul's doing here is he's giving a kind of a play-by-play of their journey and where they're going and what they encountered. In verse 18, and we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. In verse 19, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. In verse 20, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. In verse 21, but after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. So he's saying, told ya. Shirley says, wow, look, like they named hurricanes, Euroclydon. Yeah. That's a better name than we give them, isn't it? In verse 22, and now I exhort you, 21, he's going, I told you so. In verse 22, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. He's saying that we're going to lose the ship, but none of us are going to die. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. In verse 24, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So this is an amazing, unusual circumstance where Paul knows he's not going to die. He's not going to die on the sea. He's not going to die, even though he knows the ship is going to be lost. He knows already that he's not going to die because he knows he's going to be brought before Caesar. Now, none of us know for sure whether we're going to be still alive in the next 5 minutes. But this is an instance where Paul knows he's not dying until he appears before Caesar because the Lord told him so. Okay? In verse 25, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. He's saying, no worries. Okay? For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. In verse 26, howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. In verse 27, but when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again to test. They're testing their depth, and found it 15 fathoms. In verse 29, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. In verse 33, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. They've been fasting for 14 days. Now they're going to, here they have to swim and stuff like that, and they're going to be very weak. So he's saying in verse 34, wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. So he's assuring them that they're all going to be fine. In verse 35, and when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. In verse 36, then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. As Shirley's telling us that a tempestuous wind means a terrible wind. Yes, ma'am, it does. In verse 37, and we were in all in the ship 260 souls. So that would be 276 souls. 276 people on the ship. In verse 38, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. So they ate and then got rid of the rest of the food. In verse 39, and when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made towards shore. In verse 41, and falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the foreparts stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. So what's happening is they're going through an area where the sea splits off like this, and you've got a sandbar in the middle. The ship is stuck on this sandbar in the front, but the currents and the waves are bashing the back of the ship and just ripping it to shreds. It says here in 41, falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. So what Paul was told did come to pass. Now, I don't see any questions, so we're going to just go ahead and dive right in to Acts chapter 28. I believe this is our final chapter of this book. And what I have, what I'd really like to do, I think by God's grace, is that once we finish up this last chapter of Acts, we're going to have some good time remaining, hopefully, and we're going to go into the timeline. We haven't done the timeline for a while, and that's so much fun. We can go into the timeline. You know, we're expecting the two witnesses any day now, anywhere between now and really December 19th. They would, it looks like they will come at some point this year of 2018, show up. And also the temple is due to be rebuilt. We'll go through the evidence and the things and the events that are expected between, now and when we go, when the evacuation occurs. That's always really fun to do that. Okay, let's hit chapter 28. Let's see. Chapter 28, verse 1. And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one. So they were very hospitable because of the present rain and because of the cold. So it says the barbarous people showed us no little kindness. They were very hospitable and kind. And so it's interesting, though, that they're referred to as barbarous people. What he's talking about is they're natives. They're island natives here. But they're very kind people. They have showed them great kindness, for they kindled a fire, received all of them, and brought them in out of the rain and the cold. By God's grace. Okay. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, There came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. Straight up.